NASA's James Webb Space Telescope has found an unexpected chemical clue in 3I Atlas, and it is forcing astronomers to look more carefully at where this interstellar comet was born. When scientists first examined Webb's data, they were not simply looking for another picture of a comet. They were looking for a chemical fingerprint from a world that formed somewhere beyond our solar system. What appeared in the data did not match the familiar chemistry of most comets we know. Instead, Webb revealed unusual proportions of carbon, hydrogen, and their heavier forms, offering a glimpse into an environment that may have existed billions of years ago, long before our sun was born. That detail matters. The 3I Atlas is already extraordinary for one simple reason. It did not originate here. It was discovered on July 1st, 2025 by the NASA-funded Atlas Survey Telescope in Chile, and its path showed that it was traveling through the solar system on a hyperbolic trajectory. In other words, the sun could bend its path, but it could not capture the object permanently. This was not a comet making a familiar loop around our star. It was a visitor from another planetary system, passing through once before continuing back into interstellar space. And that made every observation far more valuable. For decades, astronomers believed that comets could preserve some of the original ingredients from the environments where planetary systems formed. Our own comets are essentially frozen archives. They contain water, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and other materials that survived from the early solar system. But 3I Atlas offered something we had almost never had before, the chance to examine that kind of frozen archive from somewhere else. The question was no longer simply what this comet was made of. The deeper question was what its chemistry could tell us about the planetary system that created it. Webb was perfectly suited for that investigation because it does not see the universe the way your eyes do. The telescope specializes in infrared light, wavelengths that can reveal chemical fingerprints hidden within faint astronomical objects. Different molecules absorb and emit infrared light at specific wavelengths. By separating that light, Webb's instruments can identify which gases are present and estimate how much of them surrounds an object. Think of it as reading a barcode written in invisible light. The barcode does not tell you everything about an object, but it can reveal ingredients that an ordinary image cannot. That distinction becomes especially important with a comet. The solid nucleus is difficult to see directly because it is surrounded by a cloud of gas and dust called the coma. As sunlight warms the comet, some of its frozen material turns directly into gas, carrying molecules away from the surface. The coma can therefore act like a giant chemical envelope surrounding the nucleus. And in the case of 3I Atlas, Webb was able to study that envelope in extraordinary detail. The first important clue was already unusual. Webb detected methane in the comet's infrared spectrum, making this the first interstellar object in which the telescope directly detected methane gas. Even more interesting, the methane did not behave exactly like the water vapor surrounding the comet. It appeared to be concentrated closer to the nucleus, suggesting that some of it may have remained protected beneath the surface until heat from the comet's passage near the sun reached deeper layers. The chemistry was beginning to tell a story, but it was only part of the story. Webb also found that 3I Atlas was unusually rich in carbon dioxide compared with water when compared with typical comets from our solar system. That does not mean the object is impossible or artificial. It means its chemical recipe appears different from the recipes we are most familiar with. And that difference is scientifically important because chemistry records temperature, radiation, available materials, and the environment in which planetary bodies formed. This is where the mystery becomes much deeper. Imagine two planetary systems forming around different stars. One develops in an environment where icy material remains extremely cold for long periods. Another forms under very different conditions, perhaps with a different mixture of gases and dust. The resulting comets could preserve those differences for billions of years. By studying 3I's Atlas, astronomers are effectively trying to reconstruct the conditions of a planetary system that we cannot visit and may never identify directly. That is an extraordinary scientific opportunity. But Webb's later observations went beyond simply identifying methane and carbon dioxide. In December 2025, as 3I Atlas moved away from the sun, Webb's near-infrared spectrograph, known as NIR spec, was used to examine the chemical composition of the comet in much greater detail. Instead of only asking which molecules were present, researchers could investigate subtle differences in the atoms making up those molecules. This is where the unexpected clue becomes especially powerful. Not every atom of the same element is identical. Some versions contain additional neutrons and are called isotopes. Carbon, for example, commonly exists as carbon-12, while carbon-13 contains one extra neutron. Hydrogen also has a heavier form called deuterium. These tiny differences may sound insignificant, but to an astronomer, they can preserve information about the environment in which a molecule formed. And 3I Atlas showed unusual isotope ratios. Researchers found surprisingly high proportions of heavy carbon and heavy hydrogen in the comet's observed molecules. Those measurements suggest that 3I Atlas formed under conditions very different from the conditions that produced most known comets in our own solar system. The evidence points toward an environment that was exceptionally cold and distant from the central star of its original planetary system. That is not a conclusion pulled from imagination. It comes from chemistry. In more than 25 years of studying astronomical discoveries, one principle repeatedly stands out. The most revealing information is often hidden in the smallest differences. A faint spectral line or an unusual isotope ratio can tell you more about an object's history than a spectacular photograph ever could. With 3I Atlas, those tiny differences may be preserving a record of its ancient birthplace. And there is another reason this matters. Scientists estimate that 3I Atlas may have been ejected from its original planetary system billions of years ago. If that interpretation is correct, the comet could have spent an enormous fraction of its existence traveling through interstellar space before encountering our solar system. Its surface may have been altered by radiation and time, but deeper material could still preserve clues from the environment where it formed. That means Webb is not merely studying a comet passing through our neighborhood. It is studying a piece of another planetary history. The object itself is also moving on a trajectory that leaves no realistic opportunity for a second visit. NASA estimates that 3I Atlas came no closer than about 170 million miles, or 270 million kilometers from Earth. There was no danger to our planet. Its significance comes from its origin, not from any threat it poses. It is a rare scientific sample delivered by nature without a spacecraft ever needing to land on it. And because it is leaving, astronomers have had to use every available observation while the opportunity exists. Webb is only one part of that effort. Hubble observed the comet. NASA's SphereX mission studied its infrared emissions. TESS observed it again to investigate its activity and rotation. Other spacecraft and observatories also contributed observations. Each instrument sees a different part of the story. One can reveal structure, another can measure motion, another can identify gases. Together, these observations allow scientists to separate what is genuinely unusual from what may simply be the normal behavior of an unfamiliar comet. That distinction is critical. A strange observation does not automatically mean a strange object. Sometimes the mystery disappears when better measurements arrive. Other times, the new measurement exposes something deeper about nature that previous models did not fully capture. With 3I Atlas, researchers are still working through that boundary. What we know is that its chemistry is unusual. We know its isotope ratios carry evidence of a formation environment unlike the one that produced most solar system comets. We know Webb detected methane and found an unexpectedly strong carbon dioxide signature. And we know the comet's chemical composition may preserve evidence from a planetary system that existed long before our own. But one question remains particularly important. If these chemical differences truly record the conditions of its birthplace, then 3I Atlas may allow astronomers to test something much larger than the history of one comet. Whether planetary systems across the galaxy build their icy worlds from the same basic recipe, or whether our solar system is chemically unusual in ways we have only begun to recognize, the answer is buried deeper in the measurements. The leading scientific explanation is that 3I Atlas does not behave differently because it violates known physics, but because it formed in a very different environment from the comets we have studied close to home. Its unusual carbon dioxide, methane, and isotope signatures may be telling us that the object spent its earliest history in an exceptionally cold region of another planetary system, where chemistry unfolded differently from the conditions that shaped our own solar system. That distinction is important. A comet is not simply a ball of ice flying through space. It is a record of the environment in which its materials first came together. The molecules trapped inside it can preserve information about temperature, radiation, and the availability of different chemical ingredients. If 3I Atlas really did form far from its original star, its chemistry may be showing us what happens when a planetary system builds icy bodies under conditions unlike those around the young sun. This is why the Webb observations are so valuable. The telescope's infrared instruments can separate the light coming from the comet's coma into individual wavelengths. Those wavelengths reveal molecules because each molecule interacts with light in its own recognizable way. It is a little like identifying instruments in an orchestra by their individual notes. You cannot see the molecule directly, but its spectral signature tells you that it is there. And once you know which molecules are present, you can begin asking a much harder question. Why are they present in those proportions? For 3I Atlas, carbon dioxide appears unusually abundant relative to water. Methane is also present, and the distribution of those materials provides clues about how the comet's interior has been responding to sunlight. One possibility is that some volatile material remained preserved beneath the surface during the comet's long journey through interstellar space. As the object approached the sun, increasing solar heat would have penetrated the outer layers and released gases from regions that had remained protected for an enormous span of time. The surface, in other words, may not tell the whole story. That is a familiar principle in planetary science. The outermost layer of an object can be altered by radiation, collisions, heating, and the vacuum of space. Deeper material can remain much closer to its original state. For an interstellar comet, that difference becomes especially significant because the object may have traveled through space for billions of years before entering our solar system. To understand the scale, picture a world leaving its birthplace and crossing the space between stars for longer than the entire history of human civilization. During that journey, its surface is exposed to cosmic radiation and extremely low temperatures, while its deeper material can remain isolated beneath layers of frozen compounds. When the object finally passes near a star again, the energy begins changing that ancient surface chemistry. That is an extraordinary natural experiment, and it may explain part of what Webb is seeing. But the isotope evidence adds another layer. Isotopes are different versions of the same element, and their relative abundance can preserve information about the environment in which molecules formed. Heavier isotopes generally respond differently to chemical reactions and physical conditions than their lighter counterparts. By measuring these subtle differences, researchers can investigate the history of material that would otherwise be impossible to trace. This is one reason astronomers are so interested in 3I Atlas. Its chemical composition is not merely a list of ingredients, it may be a timestamp from another planetary system. In my years of studying planetary systems, one lesson becomes clearer with every new discovery. Unusual chemistry is rarely interesting because it is strange by itself. It is interesting because it points toward a physical environment that produced it. A chemical fingerprint is evidence of a process. The real scientific challenge is reconstructing that process from the evidence left behind, and that reconstruction takes time. Researchers have to compare 3I Atlas with known comets, laboratory measurements, computer models, and observations at different wavelengths. They must also consider whether sunlight has altered the chemistry after the comet entered our solar system. An apparent difference between an interstellar comet and a solar system comet could reflect where it formed, but it could also partly reflect how long it has been exposed to its new environment. That is why a single observation cannot settle the entire question. If you enjoy exploring discoveries like this through clear, evidence-based science, consider subscribing so we can keep examining these rare windows into the universe together. The next challenge is separating origin from evolution. When a comet approaches the sun, its behavior changes rapidly. Solar radiation heats its surface, frozen compounds begin turning into gas, and dust can be carried outward with that escaping material. This process creates the coma and can produce a tail. The activity can make an ancient object appear dramatically different from what it looked like while traveling through interstellar space. For 3I Atlas, astronomers therefore have to ask which features are inherited and which features developed during its passage through our solar system. That question is more difficult than it sounds. Imagine finding a piece of ancient ice that had spent millions or billions of years exposed to an entirely different climate before arriving on your doorstep. If you analyzed only its melted surface, you might learn something about the journey, but you would also risk confusing the journey with the place where the ice originally formed. Planetary scientists face a similar problem when interpreting an active comet. The evidence supports the idea that 3I Atlas contains unusually preserved material, but researchers still have to determine exactly how that material was assembled and how much of its present appearance has been modified by the sun. That distinction matters. Another important clue comes from the object's motion. Its hyperbolic trajectory tells us that the sun did not create a long-term orbit for 3I Atlas. Gravity bends its path, but the object has enough energy to continue outward again. This is fundamentally different from a typical comet that repeatedly returns after traveling around the sun. For astronomers, that trajectory provides the strongest evidence that 3I Atlas originated outside our solar system, and that creates an opportunity we rarely get. Our solar system has been studied extensively because we can send spacecraft to its planets, moons, asteroids, and comets. We can measure their surfaces, analyze their atmospheres, and sometimes even return samples to Earth. But another planetary system is usually too distant for that kind of investigation. We cannot simply fly a spacecraft to a random star system and collect one of its comets. 3I Atlas has effectively brought a sample of another planetary environment into our observational reach. Not a physical sample, a chemical one. Every photon collected by Webb carries information from the object. The telescope cannot touch the comet, but its instruments can analyze the light produced by gases and dust around it. That is enough to begin reconstructing the conditions under which those materials formed. What experienced astronomers learn is that scientific understanding rarely arrives as one dramatic answer. It develops through layers of evidence. First comes the observation, then comes a measurement, then a comparison with existing models, then another observation that either strengthens the explanation or forces researchers to reconsider it. 3I Atlas is now moving through that process. The leading interpretation is that its unusual chemistry reflects a birthplace and formation history different from our own comets. But the data does not yet tell us every detail of that history. We still do not have a complete picture of the star system where 3I Atlas formed, the exact conditions surrounding its birth, or the precise sequence of events that eventually expelled it into interstellar space. Those are enormous unknowns. Yet even without answering them, scientists have already learned something profound. Planetary systems do not necessarily produce identical worlds from identical ingredients. The basic laws of chemistry and physics are universal, but the environments in which those laws operate can be dramatically different. A cold disk around a young star can produce one chemical outcome. A warmer region can produce another. Radiation can alter molecules. Gravity can rearrange young planetary systems. Encounters between planets can eject smaller bodies into interstellar space. Over billions of years, a comet can become a traveler carrying evidence of all those processes. And this may be why 3I Atlas matters beyond the object itself. If future observations show that its chemical signature is common among interstellar objects, astronomers may begin to suspect that planetary systems across the galaxy share broader chemical patterns than we currently recognize. If its composition turns out to be unusually extreme, then our own solar system may occupy a more distinctive place in the cosmic landscape. Either possibility would be valuable. The next generation of observations will be especially important because scientists can compare measurements made at different stages of the comet's passage. As 3I Atlas changes its distance from the Sun, different layers of material may become exposed, providing additional information about its interior chemistry. Improved observations could help researchers determine whether the unusual gases originate from shallow surface deposits, deeper reservoirs, or a combination of processes. More observations will be needed to confirm that picture, but that uncertainty should not diminish the discovery. It is the reason the discovery is scientifically interesting. The telescope has not handed us a final answer. It has given us evidence strong enough to ask a better question. What kind of planetary system creates a comet like 3I Atlas? That question reaches far beyond one visitor passing through our solar system. It asks how worlds are assembled around other stars, how chemical ingredients are distributed through young planetary systems, and how much of that ancient material can survive after a planet-building system breaks apart and sends its smallest members into the space between stars. For the first time, astronomers have an opportunity to investigate those questions using material that came from somewhere else. And as 3I Atlas continues its journey outward, the most valuable thing it may leave behind is not a photograph, but a clearer understanding of how many different ways nature can build a planetary world.